Eran Yashiv, Professor Eran Yashiv. We'll talk about the structural challenges and unsustainable dynamics. Eran is, actually, he and I have two connections. We're actually in the same department at Tel-Aviv University, Department of Public Policy. Eran heads the department, and he is our policy program chair in economics at the Taub Center. Eran.
Yeah. Good morning. Let me join Danny in thanking the Taub family for supporting this research. I'll be presenting some pretty daunting problems of the Israeli economy and Israeli society, and I think this financial contribution is extremely important in letting us work on possible solutions, possible policy solutions to these problems. Let me perhaps start with, or maybe telling you just before the key ideas, what this particular economic policy program is about. This is a group of about 15 people, roughly half of them policymakers or ex-policymakers. Danny mentioned ex-director generals of the Ministry of Finance, which is a key job in the Israeli economy, and the other half are leading macroeconomists within the economy, including economists, academic economists that have been involved with major policy changes, such as Eitan Sheshinsky from the Hebrew University, who has just presided over a committee that did very important fiscal reform. What I'm going to present now is partly the insights gained from the discussions of this program that meets 4 times a year. So the key ideas, sort of to summarize what I'm going to say, is that Israel has some pretty big problems, beginning with economic problems, but these translate into social problems, and they are aggravated by political issues. And as the title of my talk suggests, basically, Israel is on an unsustainable course. The current dynamics lead to a pretty impossible situation, as I'll try to demonstrate, and something needs to change. The question is how and in what way. Obviously, at Taub, we are trying to think of good ways in which it can change. However, let me say that right now, at this moment, we don't see any short-term prescription for policy actually being implemented. That is, the current Israeli government and bureaucracy are not on the verge of implementing any major reform, though major reforms are needed. So I'll try to explain what the problems are and what kind of reforms are needed. So I'll start by outlining the economic challenges. Then I'll touch on demographics. Demographics turn out to be a very key issue, not only in Israel, but also in Israel. Then discuss a bit the political institution. Though I'm an economist, I think the political economy part of things is extremely important. Then some recent developments that others will also touch upon. Then what are the policy challenges and what can we expect things to happen over the short and medium term. So let me start with the economics. And just to demonstrate that it's not just our views, let me cite someone pretty respectable, someone that's considered the #1 policymaker in Israel in economic terms, and that is the governor of the Bank of Israel, Stanley Fischer, who some of you may know was professor of economics at MIT, head of department at MIT, deputy managing director of the IMF, and so on. He's been 7 years now governor of the bank, and each year the bank submits an annual report. The most recent one was just submitted about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and with this report comes a letter addressed to the government and to the Knesset, and in this report he wrote what appears in the screen next to you, which is, first of all, some pretty good things on the current macroeconomic situation. GDP growth has been very healthy, almost 5%. Unemployment has been low. And in fact, various other measures like inflation, the current account, and so on have been actually wonderful. In this sense, Israel is in a very good macroeconomic position, at least over the past few years. However, and maybe for the first time in a long while, he added some things to the letter, and I think these things the Taub Center has been saying for years now. But he hasn't been saying them for years, and I think maybe it's partially our influence that made him add these words. And these words speak, first of all, about problems with what I shall call the human infrastructure. That Israel has big issues of populations which are disadvantaged and which do not participate, basically do not participate enough in the labor market and are therefore poor. So in fact, these are populations with low education, low skills, low participation in the labor market, and high rates of poverty. And the main ones are the ultra-Orthodox Jews and the Arabs, Israeli Arabs. And I'll speak about the demographics of these two groups in a little while, but if you read out what Stanley Fischer has written in this new letter, it seems pretty clear that he is concerned by the situation of those groups very much. And he also speaks about, in the same letter, about what needs to be done, which is much more investment in proper education for these groups, much more policy designed to improve their participation in Israeli labor market and Israeli economy in general. He also went on in the same letter, before I go on with his letter, let me point out to some facts, some key facts, because we can give you, Danny spoke of facts, we can give you lots and lots of facts, and they are all in the Taub reports. Let me give you some key facts about those disadvantaged groups. First of all, as you can see, hopefully you can see from the screen, on the screen, the rates of employment of these groups is extremely low. That is, just to give you a benchmark, in Western economies, like the US economy, in with prime age people, participation and employment rates in the labor market are at least 70% or around 70%, with prime age men going to 80 and 90%. These groups, the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, have much lower rates, as you can see on the screen. In particular, Arab women, and in particular, ultra-Orthodox men. With simple words, I know not all of you are economists here, in simple words, big chunks of people are not working, which means not producing, which means not earning any labor income. So this is, and you'll see again the demographic figures later, this is something that's not experienced by too many economies, that important population groups are not producing, meaning that the economy doesn't have enough output, if you like, to have a reasonable GDP per capita, enough output per person, if from the simple arithmetic that not enough people are working enough. That also brings to another fact, the last bullet point here, that because of the poverty rate, because of the fact that these groups do not work, they are poor, and because of that, inequality is high. There is a measure, a famous measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient. 0 is for complete equality, 1 is for complete inequality. Israel has a coefficient of 0.38, which is pretty high. In fact, if you compare to other Western nations, it's among the highest, comparable to the US. And as you may have been following the press here, the US has an inequality problem. Okay. Let me move on. So these are just short key facts. Let me move on to another thing Governor Fisher has written, and I understand some people at the back cannot see everything, so I'll say out loud the main words. There is not enough infrastructure investment in physical infrastructure. So I was speaking about the human infrastructure. The physical infrastructure is in bad shape as well. And Governor Fisher in his letter speaks about road infrastructure in particular that is insufficient. To give some numbers, basically the infrastructure investment in Israel, the public investment is half of that of Western nations. 2% of GDP rather than 4% of GDP. So at the same time as we have a problem with people, not enough people working, we have a problem with the physical infrastructure that there's not enough of it, and that Israel lags behind in some cases to a very high degree. By physical infrastructure, I first of all mean roads, but also things like electricity, water systems, sewage systems, all these kinds of physical systems. Without going into too much detail, the basic idea is that if your human infrastructure is insufficient and your physical infrastructure is insufficient, you have a problem. You have a problem maintaining reasonable economic level, which also means that you are hurting your long-term economic prospects. The prospects for growth in Israel are diminished because of these facts. And this is in fact what Governor Fisher warns about in his letter, that while the current macroeconomic indicators are good, the long-term growth prospects are not good. Without going into too much detail, let me give you another set of facts relating to demographics. And this is actually mind-boggling. The current population of Israel consists of 20% Arabs, a little over 20% Arabs, and about 10% ultra-Orthodox. That is 30% of the population, almost a third, are these economically disadvantaged groups that I was referring to earlier. The best projections we have say that in 20 years' time, they will be about 40% of the population. Think about this for a moment. This is something unknown, at least in advanced economies, and I think even not in emerging economies, that 40% of the economy is going to consist of the population of the economy, is going to consist of people who are very far behind in terms of economic performance. They don't have the right level of education or the correct education. They don't work enough. They don't participate in the labor market. They don't earn. They don't produce. I'm saying this not to blame these groups, but I'm stating this as facts. If the situation with these groups does not change, and it's an if, but if it does not change, it's very hard to see Israel in 20 years' time as an advanced economy. It will be more like a third world poor economy if this goes on without change. So this already points to what I was saying about unsustainable dynamics and challenges. And I guess my colleagues later on will fill all sorts of details on these very same groups as well. Now, if we all know this, that is, if Governor Fisher wrote this in his letter, if Taub writes about this for years, if this is well known, then do people do anything about it, or is it about to change? Well, the strange answer is that no. It's a bit like the issue of climate change and global warming. It's a huge, severe problem. People know of it for years, but if you ask the experts, very little is being done, practically. Likewise in Israel, the situation of the Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox has been known, is known, and very little has been done. And I claim that this is partly because of the political situation. And you can analyze the political situation for hours. Let me give a few brief examples. The basic idea is that the political spectrum in Israel is very fragmented. Israel consists of heterogeneous groups that are also represented in parliament by heterogeneous parties, and it's completely fragmented. As an example, let me do a small comparison. Israel versus the UK. Both held elections almost at the same time, and both have a parliamentary system. Here are the results of the Israeli elections in 2009, and all the polls indicate that the next elections, probably to be held within a year, will be very much the same in terms of this pie chart. The pie chart will look very much the same. Maybe some identities will change. But basically, you've got 12 parties, each receiving a little piece of the cake. The UK held elections about a year later, in 2010, and this is the pie for the UK. There are 3 major parties, in fact, 2 big ones and 1 medium one, and that has always been the case in the UK. Much more cohesive structure of government in the sense of parliament. This has obvious repercussions. For example, the fact that parliaments change a lot, government cabinets change a lot. Ministers in Israel serve for about 2 years, 1.5 years. You can't do much with such political instability. Obviously, the other country that comes to mind is Italy, and Italy has its own major problems that you all know of. I mean, now the whole world is suffering from Italy's problem, which comes after Greece's problems. So again, like another figure that those of you who can see, it's written up there, 18 elections in 60 years, 18 elections for parliament in 60 years of existence of the State of Israel. With such a fragmented political system, it's hard to institute reform. Israel is built of coalition governments, of these small parties, and they block reform. Because every reform you propose, there'll be some parties which will oppose it. Right now, if you propose to reform anything for the ultra-Orthodox sector, the parties like Shas will oppose it. If you propose to do other things, the Immigrants' Party will oppose it, and so on and so forth. You cannot move much economic or social reform without reforming the political system. By the way, there was an attempt to reform a bit the political system, a reform I think that everybody agrees has failed. So personally, I'm not optimistic that there will be political reform, and therefore I'm not optimistic there will be social or economic policy reform. Let me point to two sets of recent developments that can give you an idea whether Israel will be moving towards any reform. A positive development, at least in my mind, was the social protests in the summer of 2011. Danny is going to talk about this afternoon, so I will not elaborate. But basically, the social protests were mass protests that brought out on the streets almost 500,000 protesters, and they brought to the general public knowledge and conscience and consciousness, both conscience and consciousness, key issues, key economic and social issues. Although the main demand was not to reform the Arabs or the ultra-Orthodox or the physical infrastructure, the demand for a welfare state, a Nordic-style welfare state, pointed to the issues of poverty, of inequality, of bad economic performance. But however, there was no further result to these demonstrations, at least so far. That is, the government set up a committee, the so-called Trachtenberg Committee. Danny and I appeared before that committee presenting our views. in my mind, that committee made minor recommendations for policy change and recommendations that will sort of be diluted to zero through the course of time. So on the one hand, protests that did raise consciousness, but on the other hand, did not achieve any tangible results. More worryingly, there was a whole set of developments, and I won't bore you with details, political initiatives in the Knesset, including some new laws that you can basically sum up as undemocratic changes. All sorts of things that limit freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of movement of people, and so on. This is a very unwelcome development. You can make the case that economic growth is promoted by democracy and by democratic institutions. If you turn into something less democratic or non-democratic, that's bad news for lots of things. So here are the policy challenges. Given all this information, the policy challenges are to deal with the non-working sectors, with non-working populations, to invest in human infrastructure, to invest in physical infrastructure, to do the political reform needed to carry out those changes, to respond to the protesters' real needs, and a whole range of stuff. This list is pretty daunting, and my take on it is pessimistic. I do not see policymakers running to the policy board and writing up plans and actually implementing them. And at Taub, in our discussions of policy, including those guys that I mentioned that are ex-policymakers, they have not given us reason for more optimism. A lot of our discussions revolved through their ideas that there is a lot of policy inertia in Israel. It's hard to change the course of policy. It's hard to change even the government budget. And this comes from the people with first-hand knowledge of these processes in Israel. However, we did, as a Taub Center, make up a serious document with policy proposals that tackles these questions that I've been talking about. And following our appearance at the Trachtenberg Commission, we published this document, which is available online as well. This is the cover of the document, and it was co-written by all the chairs of the panels in Taub, all of them sitting here, and all of them whom we'll be talking later. This is a fairly long document. I will not obviously spell out the whole 60 or 70 pages, but basically it gives concrete ideas about fiscal reform, infrastructure reform, social reform, reform of the healthcare system, of the education system, and so on and so forth. Some of the ideas you'll be hearing throughout the day from my colleagues. So it's not that ideas are lacking. That's another important point. It's not that Israel just has problems and we should be pessimistic and go home, depressed. We do have solutions. We do have ideas. We even have some budget figures. That is, we give our proposals some estimates of how much it would cost to do X or Y or Z to solve the problems. The underlying problem is lack of political will or political implementation of these kinds of solutions. But obviously we'll continue to make these kinds of proposals. Maybe, well, I've repeated several times that the outlook is not that great. Let me conclude by saying where I see things going. I think on the positive side, because of people like us, like our work, there is heightened knowledge and consciousness of what the problems are. I think before the summer of 2011, before the protests, people in Israel were much less aware of what's going on in the economic sphere and consequently in the social sphere. So once problems are recognized, this is already much better. However, there is a disconnect between this and actual ability to correct course, to change course. The current course is leading us to 40% Arabs and ultra-Orthodox in 2030, and with ultra-Orthodox women on average having 6.6 children, that's the official statistic, this may become even worse later. What can change? Well, if fertility of all the ultra-Orthodox changes, goes down, if the education of the ultra-Orthodox changes, for example, becomes geared to more practical subjects of learning, and my colleagues will be talking about this later, then the situation may improve. So it's not unsustainable dynamics that would lead us to hell for sure. It's dynamics that lead to a bad place unless we take corrective action. What kind of corrective action we can take? Well, we can take lots of policies. Just to give 2 or 3 examples, we can create employment centers for both the Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox, geared specifically to those groups of the population. Centers that will serve to give information, to match workers and firms, to bring people together closer to the labor market. We can, for example, create daycare centers for Arab women. Amazingly, there are hardly any governmental daycare centers in the Arab community in Israel. 20% of the population does not have daycare centers. Then we shouldn't be surprised that Arab women do not work enough. We can invest much more in roads, in electricity, in water. We can bring up the investment to Western levels. How do we do that? We can raise taxes. The current Prime Minister has lowered taxes to a dizzying degree. We can raise some of it back. That was part of the plan that we presented. So what I'm saying is that there are concrete policy steps that people can take. Will the political system accept that? Not in the near term. So I would sum up the situation as follows. And here I'm going to cite Stanley Fischer citing someone else. There was a US economist called Herbert Stein who wrote years ago that if something is unsustainable, it will stop. The question is how it will stop. Will it stop with Israel becoming a less advanced economy, a poor economy, with low standards of living, with perhaps the good people leaving? Or will it stop after Israeli policymakers undertake substantial reform? So I think this is the crucial issue for Israel. I think Taub has an important say in formulating ideas for it. And I'm sure these subjects will permeate the discussion throughout the day. Thank you.